At 02:58 a.m., long before any podium statement or televised remark, the shift had already begun. Orders moved through channels designed never to be seen. Navigation routes updated. Timelines tightened. A dispersed set of U.S. naval assets started aligning toward a common vector. Not rushing, not drifting, converging. By the time dawn approached, the president's words gave the movement a name. An armada, not a fleet, not a task force, an armada. Language matters in moments like this, because words don't just describe posture, they harden it. When the phrase left his mouth, it did more than signal confidence. It collapsed ambiguity. It told allies, adversaries, and markets that something had changed, and that it had changed fast. At sea, the change was already visible to those who knew how to look. Carrier groups adjusted spacing. Destroyers altered patrol geometry. Subsurface assets repositioned silently beneath shipping lanes that had grown more crowded, not with vessels, but with attention. Radar horizons overlapped. Defensive envelopes thickened. What had been a presence became a formation. This was not a surge born of panic. It was momentum formalized. Inside U.S. command structures, the phrase armada wasn't used. What mattered there were numbers, coverage arcs, response intervals, and sustainment windows. How long could this posture hold? How far could it extend without fraying? How quickly could it pivot if words became orders? Because when political language escalates faster than deployments, militaries are forced to catch up or slow it down. Across the water, Iran was already watching. Surveillance feeds lit up with density changes. Signal analysts noticed correlation patterns tightening. Movement that once looked rotational now looked directional. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't routine. This was alignment. Iranian command centers absorbed the information without spectacle. There were no alarms, no public reactions at first. The system had learned not to flinch too early, but internally, posture assessments updated in real time. An armada implies endurance. Endurance implies intent. Within hours, Iran's defensive grid recalibrated, not louder, not faster, sharper. Missile units reviewed engagement logic. Naval elements repositioned under camouflage and dispersion protocols. Drone teams increased readiness checks without launching anything. The goal was not reaction. The goal was readiness without provocation. But readiness, once saturated, radiates pressure whether intended or not. The president's statement traveled faster than the ships themselves. Headlines raced across time zones. Markets responded before diplomats could. Energy prices ticked upward. Insurance algorithms recalculated. Airlines adjusted routing buffers quietly, without explanation. The world recognized the pattern. Words had outpaced movement, but movement was catching up. Inside the armada itself, crews moved through briefings stripped of rhetoric. There was no talk of Iran, no talk of confrontation, just operational clarity. Patrol sequences, engagement restrictions, emission discipline. Every sailor understood the environment they were entering, not as war, but as proximity. Proximity is where accidents live. As the day unfolded, the posture shift became undeniable. The armada's configuration optimized for layered defense and rapid response, not strike initiation, but deterrence does not announce its intentions cleanly. To the observer, readiness and aggression often look identical. Iran's leadership faced a familiar but narrowing dilemma. Respond too loudly and risk validating escalation. Respond too quietly and risk appearing unprepared. The word armada had raised expectations, not just abroad, but at home. Warnings resurfaced, carefully phrased, deliberately firm, full readiness, sovereignty, consequences. The language was familiar, but the timing was sharper. This was no longer about a single deployment. It was about trajectory. The armada did not appear overnight. It assembled through logistics, planning, and coordination that had been underway long before the statement. But the statement changed how the assembly would be interpreted from this point forward. From now on, every movement would be framed as confirmation. As daylight stretched into evening, both sides settled into an intensified rhythm. The U.S. posture emphasized coordination and predictability. Signals meant to reassure allies while discouraging misinterpretation. Iran's posture emphasized dispersion and ambiguity. Signals meant to complicate targeting while avoiding provocation. Two logics running in parallel, neither fully compatible. Late that night, the first true test arrived, not with an attack, but with a question. An unfamiliar contact appeared briefly at the edge of multiple detection systems. Too ambiguous to classify immediately, too close to ignore. Both sides tracked it. Neither side moved aggressively. Seconds passed, then the contact faded. No action followed, no statements issued, no escalation occurred, but the moment lingered. Because it revealed the truth beneath the armada narrative. The danger was not in what anyone planned to do, but in what might happen unintentionally when systems run this close for this long. Inside Iranian reviews, the incident was logged as a warning sign. Inside U.S. briefings, it was flagged as a reminder, not of threat, but of fragility. The armada continued its approach. Not closer in distance, but closer in meaning. Each hour it remained aligned under the banner of that word, the less room there was to reinterpret it as anything else. This was the fast shift. Not tanks crossing borders, not missiles launching, but posture hardening faster than diplomacy could soften it. By the end of the first phase, one reality had become clear to everyone watching closely. The word ARMADA had done what deployments alone could not. It had accelerated perception. And once perception accelerates, reality has no choice but to follow. By the second phase, the word ARMADA had stopped being a headline and started becoming a condition. This was the point where posture stopped feeling temporary. Inside U.S. naval command rooms, the emphasis shifted from assembly to sustainability. An armada is not defined by how quickly it arrives, but by how long it can remain coherent under pressure. Fuel cycles were recalculated, crew rotations reviewed, logistics vessels quietly adjusted routes to support duration, not display. Endurance had entered the equation. That single adjustment carried weight far beyond charts and schedules. Endurance means commitment. Commitment narrows political flexibility. Once endurance planning begins, walking back posture becomes harder, not operationally, but symbolically. Iran understood this immediately. Their intelligence picture now showed not just movement, but layering. The kind of layering that assumes friction, attrition, and prolonged alert. The kind that does not expect resolution overnight. Inside Iranian command centers, the internal conversation hardened. Not outwardly, but structurally. The assumption was no longer, how long will this last? But how do we live inside this? Living inside tension requires discipline. Air defense units transitioned fully into sustained alert protocols. Not peak readiness burns out too quickly, but elevated endurance readiness. Crews trained for long watches, not short crises. Decision loops were lengthened intentionally to prevent reflex action. This was restraint engineered into process. At sea, Iranian naval elements adopted a similar logic. Fewer visible maneuvers, more shadowing, less signaling, more observation. When facing an armada, the goal was not confrontation. It was survival without submission. The armada's presence reshaped the electromagnetic environment. Sensors layered over sensors, signals crossed and overlapped. Every radar ping carried meaning. Every silence invited interpretation. This was where modern conflict becomes psychological. Neither side was trying to frighten the other into submission. They were trying to avoid being frightened into a mistake. Late into the second phase, internal pressure began to mount on both sides, but from different sources. Binary choices are dangerous, because real-world outcomes are rarely binary. The armada remained. Iran remained alert. The world remained uneasy. But the pace slowed enough for reflection to re-enter decision-making. That alone prevented catastrophe. Yet everyone involved understood the truth beneath the surface. This was not a resolution. It was a pause shaped by restraint, discipline, and shared awareness of unacceptable risk. A pause that could last days, or shatter in minutes. The next phase would determine whether this pause became precedent or merely delay. The final phase did not begin with movement. It began with restraint becoming intentional. By this point, everyone inside the system understood the truth that never appears in headlines. Escalation is easy, but control is rare. The armada had arrived. The warnings had been issued. The posture had shifted fast. What remained was the hardest part of modern power, knowing when to stop pressing without appearing to yield. Inside U.S. command circles, the conversation changed tone again, not softer, more precise. The armada had done its job in one critical sense. It had clarified boundaries. Iran's responses had been measured, disciplined, and unmistakably defensive. That clarity mattered more than dominance. Dominance creates reactions. Clarity creates choices. The question now was how to preserve that clarity without forcing the system back toward compression. Prolonged alignment carried diminishing returns. Every additional day increased fatigue, interpretation risk, and the chance that routine variance would be mistaken for intent. So the posture evolved, quietly, not withdrawal, not dispersal. Rebalancing, patrol geometries widened just enough to reintroduce depth. Operational rhythms slowed by fractions. Commanders were given marginally more discretion, not to act faster, but to pause longer. These changes were invisible to the public eye, but unmistakable to professionals watching patterns instead of positions. Iran noticed. Their response was equally subtle. Alert status did not drop. It stabilized. Missile crews remained ready, but no longer leaned forward psychologically. Air defense operators shifted from crisis tempo to sustained vigilance. Reaction protocols were reviewed one last time, this time with emphasis on delay over immediacy. Delay buys judgment. Judgment buys control. This mutual recalibration marked the true inflection point. The armada still existed. Iran's defenses were still active, but the system was no longer accelerating toward a decision point. It was absorbing tension instead of amplifying it. Public rhetoric followed behavior, not the other way around. Language cooled incrementally. Phrases that implied inevitability disappeared. Statements emphasized defense, stability, and readiness without consequence framing. Nothing was walked back, but nothing was sharpened further. Markets responded first, risk premiums softened, shipping insurers relaxed emergency surcharges, energy prices stabilized, not because danger had vanished, but because momentum had slowed. Momentum is what terrifies systems. Slowed momentum is survivable. Inside Iranian leadership, internal assessments turned reflective. The Armada episode was logged not as victory or defeat, but as validation. Validation that warnings mattered. Validation that discipline prevented catastrophe. Validation that endurance had limits, but restraint had value. Inside U.S. planning circles, the lesson cut just as deep. Concentrated power worked, but it also constrained. The Armada proved capability, but it also demonstrated how quickly capability could corner policy into binary outcomes. Both sides learned something uncomfortable. They were closer to losing control than they had admitted. As days turned into weeks, the Armada's posture became less theatrical and more procedural. Assets rotated. Visibility decreased without disappearing. Presence remained, but pressure eased. Iran's posture followed the same curve. Elevated readiness became normalized readiness, not relaxed, not aggressive, managed. This was not peace. It was equilibrium under memory. And memory is the most important variable in modern conflict. The next time words like Armada are spoken, they will land differently. The next time warships converge, reaction timelines will be shorter, not longer. The next time warnings are issued, they will carry the weight of this moment, of how close systems came to misreading each other into catastrophe. Crises that do not explode and leave deeper marks than those that do. They reshape doctrine. They harden assumptions. They age decision makers. For the sailors who stood watch under constant readiness, the experience would surface years later whenever formations tightened unexpectedly. For air defense operators who stared into screens during long nights of ambiguity, the tension would return whenever context lingered just long enough to be questioned. They would remember how silence felt heavier than noise, how restraint required more discipline than aggression, how the hardest order to follow was the order not given. The Armada would eventually dissolve back into routine deployments. Headlines would move on. Analysts would argue over narratives, who blinked, who deterred, who gained leverage. But inside the system, those questions mattered less. What mattered was this: the edge had been reached. The edge had been tested. And this time it held. Not because systems were flawless, not because leaders were omniscient, but because enough people understood that once control is lost, there is no graceful exit. Modern war does not announce itself with declarations. It arrives when restraint fails faster than weapons can be stopped. This time, restraint survived speed, language, and proximity. That outcome will not be remembered loudly, but it will be remembered. Because the next confrontation will not begin from calm, it will begin from here, from a world already sensitized to how fast posture can shift, how quickly words can harden reality, and how narrow the space has become between signaling strength and triggering disaster. The Armada changed nothing on the map. It changed everything in the margins. And in modern geopolitics, margins are where history turns.